One moment. Okay, so assuming that everybody can see the screen, it's looking a little different on my end. I'm hoping everybody can see it. Today, we will be discussing healthy relationships and the building blocks involved in cultivating those relationships. And before we begin, I would like to share a little bit more about Women's Advocates as an organization. So I know, as I mentioned previously, Women's Advocates is a nonprofit organization in St. Paul, Minnesota, that offers a continuum of safety, again, through prevention programming like these, emergency shelter, advocacy, and housing stability services. We began in the early 1970s actually as a legal advice helpline that supported particularly women at that time who were seeking divorce and legal name change. As folks were navigating the helpline, the legal personnel found that many women were faced at a crossroads between experiencing abuse in their home or becoming homeless and on the streets by themselves, or a lot of times with their children as well. They really wanted to create a third option for people who were in this position, and by 1974 had rallied enough money to purchase our first safe home to shelter women and children who have experienced abuse. The almost 50 years since, we've been able to expand our services and our shelter is now 3 connected homes and have an updated mission statement to better reflect what it is we believe we do, which is to walk with victim survivors and our community to break the cycle of domestic violence. If anybody is interested, you can learn more about our organization and services at wadvocates.org, and kind of see all the things that we're up to, and have been up to, especially in this last year as programming here at Women's Advocates has expanded. So, land acknowledgement, Women's Advocates work takes place on Dakota land. The area that is now St. Paul was stolen from Dakota people by the American government through centuries of wars, broken treaties, and acts of cultural genocide. Through incredible perseverance and resistance, the Dakota are still here and strong. Native women and girls face the highest risk of domestic violence, sexual assault, and intimate partner homicide. We express our gratitude for the Indigenous led organizations who are working each day towards a world without domestic and sexual violence. And as an organization, we commit ourselves to supporting tribal sovereignty with the same fervor that we support the self sovereignty of victim survivors. So, I am going to launch a little poll. What brings you here to this training today, and what specifically are you hoping to learn about? Go ahead, I'll leave this open for a minute or so, but really just feel free to click what you want. I can't remember if it lets you click multiple things, um, but in the event that it does, you can pick multiple. Oh, thank you. So today's training is divided into 3 different sections. First, we'll start to think about the types of relationships we were exposed to growing up and what we have learned are the components of a healthy relationship. Then we have an entire section dedicated to boundaries, since many of us may benefit from setting healthy boundaries in our personal and professional lives. And then ending on a discussion about building trust and other healthy relationship skills. As always, please remember that you are encouraged to take care of yourselves however you need to during and after this webinar, because everybody really is truly impacted differently by engaging in conversations about relationships and domestic violence. So it looks like the majority of folks are here to expand your understanding of abusive relationship dynamics, but we have everybody in here for different things, which I think is really um, beautiful. And I hope that everybody who filled this out and just everybody that hasn't also is able to have a better understanding of the reasons why you're here too, just as far as the content. Before we get into the first section, I would like to provide a disclaimer to all of you as participants of this training that this is intended to be an introduction to get us all thinking more about how to nurture healthy relationships in our own lives, to model these for our clients or our program participants, children, and those around us to promote a culture where healthy relationships are valued. While Women's Advocates is a domestic violence agency, as preventionists, we believe that engaging in conversations about healthy relationships and putting these skills into practice are essential to breaking the cycle of domestic violence and demonstrating that we do not have a choice, that we do have a choice to not use abuse in our relationships with one another. These are skills that we can practice, teach one another about, and continue to grow and improve. Relationships really are nuanced and complex, and this training will not cover everything. We'll have many resources at the end of the training, including our YouTube channel, where we have more specific videos about specific subtopics that we may mention briefly within this training and this context. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to leave them in the chat, and I'll do my best to answer those. So if a child were to ask you what makes a healthy relationship, how would you respond? What would come to your mind? What does come to your mind in this moment? Would you talk specifically about romantic relationships, family relationships, or friendships? When we say living in relationship, we mean more than romantic, platonic, familiar relationships. It's really about understanding the ripple effect that we can have in each other's lives, how we are all inherently connected. It's about how I move through the world and how I can in turn can affect how you move through the world and vice versa. Since we're so interconnected, it begs the question of how do we all live well together? One thing that can significantly impact our ability to live well together is abuse. When someone chooses to use abusive behaviors, because yes, it is an active choice, this person is violating the trust that the victim survivor held for them previously, that they would be treated with respect, kindness, and empathy. Authentic and healthy relationships are not nurtured when abuse is present. Relationships are not private issues that should only be discussed behind closed doors. They very much reflect how we show up in community, which can then contribute to the nature of that community's public health and overall wellness. I mentioned how relationship is not exclusive to a dating, romantic, or sexual partner or spouse, and how it really extends beyond that and even to our relationship with ourselves. On the screen, you see a bunch of circles surrounding an icon of a person. Each person has relationships that would fall into these different categories or circles. We're going to focus our time together on the inside circle, which is intimacy, because domestic violence occurs in that inside circle, and it has ripple effects and implications for our connections to folks in the remaining circles. Those that fall into the intimacy category are the people we live with, sleep with, we co-parent with. These are the people we're closest to, and also, according to crime statistics, the ones that are most likely to hurt you if the relationship is unhealthy or abusive. Even though intimate relationships are our focus today, let's just keep in mind that a lot of these concepts are also applicable to relationships in the other circles, and the way that we treat those in one circle, such as intimacy, may trickle into how we treat folks in other circles, such as service. I'm going to launch another poll. Okay, so coming into this webinar, how familiar are you with the concept of coercive control? So as you were all doing that, I'm just going to kind of talk about how something that a lot of us are not taught when we're children is that all relationships do exist on a spectrum. And this spectrum spans from unhealthy to healthy and unhealthy to abusive. But when we're growing up and observing relationships, our brains really start to conclude, well, how my parents or other adults in my life treat each other is what it means to be in a relationship. We don't label it as abusive or unhealthy or healthy. These actions just become what it is, familiar and normal to us, which informs our thinking and behaviors when we enter relationships of our own. Sometimes it can be hard to distinguish unhealthy relationship dynamics from genuinely abusive ones, and you'll see the arrows indicating that these categories exist on a continuum and are not necessarily static. Various behaviors within the same relationship can fall under every category as well. It is important for us to understand the context, dynamics, and impact to assess the nature of any given relationship. So it looks like folks overall are familiar to some extent with coercive control, which is awesome and amazing. I'm going to end this poll. We will move on. So, focusing in on the healthy section of the spectrum, there are many components that can contribute to a healthy relationship, including curiosity, teamwork, open communication, adaptability, independence, time apart, playfulness, and trust. We'll talk about trust more in depth later on, but I would like to hear from you all about what it could mean or look like to have both teamwork and independence in a relationship. So if folks have any thoughts on that, feel free to put it in the chat. I also want to point out how the presence of a lot of these components are in direct opposition of abusive traits. So, for example, time apart can replace social isolation, open communication can replace coercion or threats, and teamwork can replace control, and so on. Assessing whether a relationship is healthy or not can be tough, since a lot of people have different understandings of that, as we discussed earlier. However, these questions on the right can help us begin to identify where a relationship falls on that healthy to unhealthy to abusive spectrum. So asking yourself, does my partner encourage me to grow? Can I be myself with them? Is there equal give and take? Does our time together have meaning? And so on. Reading through this list of how someone in a healthy relationship would describe their experience could be eye-opening for you and for the people that you work with. This can also be a good guide for what survivors can look for in a new partner after experiencing abuse, since those experiences can inform their expectations moving forward. I'll put a link in the chat to the Love is Respect quiz. They have a lot of other quizzes as well. And this can really start to give someone insight and an outside, more objective perspective about the nature of the relationship. I just want to name too that sometimes these things can be easier for folks to accept and see and realize if it's coming from somebody that maybe isn't directly tied to the relationship, and that could be family members, friends, those types of things can be a lot harder to hear from those folks depending on the relationship, and I guess the level of judgment and all of those things. Let me see. It's not letting me copy and paste this. However, I you'll have access to it at the end as well. So it's also a common experience that relationships are not 100% healthy 100% of the time. We get a lot of questions from people about how it can be difficult to identify if a relationship or behavior is unhealthy or abusive, or they hesitate to call something abusive, but they don't know it's not healthy. So in these next slides, we'll discuss a little bit where the line may be, where a certain behavior may be crossing into the abusive territory. So looking at some specific examples, unhealthy. You spend so much time together that you neglect to spend time with friends or family. Abusive. Your partner controls who you see, forbids you to contact certain people, intentionally isolates you from your family or friends. Um, these are this is kind of where that line happens, right? Your partner may lie to you often or is suspicious of you. One or both of you snoop through the other's texts or emails for evidence of cheating or being places where you said that you are, but you might not be. Your partner demands to know where you are at all times, may require you to check in multiple times throughout the day, and may also threaten you if you don't share your cell phone and social media passwords. Another thing is that apologies may have excuses attached. So something that may be an example of that, and these are just examples of how it goes from unhealthy to abusive. But could be that your partner never apologizes for wrongdoings and instead blames you for their own actions and criticizes you for your response to them. Then this last one we have, unhealthy. Another example, couples counseling might help you to break unhealthy patterns and give you shared language to address challenges in your relationship. And then where the line is for abuse is couples counseling will not help and may actually make things worse. So again, just some examples and things to think about. Here are three other examples. I'd like to know your thoughts about when these behaviors would cross the line into abusive. Um, if anybody would like to put anything in the chat. So, where does it cross the line for being abusive? For the first example. So, you frequently argue about money, who is going to pay for what, whose turn it is to do the shopping, etc. How might that turn into more abusive behavior? Yes, 100%. Money is being controlled, limited access to shared accounts. One person controls everything and the other person might have no say. Yes, when only one person is making those decisions or coercing the other into spending money they don't necessarily consent to. 100%. Does anybody have anything for the you disagree often about the right way to discipline or parent your children? How does this go from unhealthy to abusive? And if anybody has anything that they would like to share from how feeling anxious or unhappy in your relationship may kind of move over to this more abusive side. I'll leave it open for maybe 30 more seconds and then we can move on. Yes, when the discipline crosses the line into abuse in an intimate partner context, again, when only one person makes the final decisions, yeah, 100%. One person might decide or control how the parenting or discipline is going to happen. Or the second parent might be afraid to suggest changes or alternative ways to um, parent or discipline their children. As far as, feeling anxious or unhappy in a relationship, where that might translate or transfer into more of an abusive situation, might be that instead of feeling or maybe this snowballs into other behaviors, anxious or unhappy, feeling unsafe or trapped in your relationship and that you are unable to leave. Thank you all. So part 2, we're gonna shift into discussing boundaries in more depth. Um I will just read a couple of these, and if folks feel free to share if any of these stand out to you. So we have boundaries are the distance at which I can love you and me simultaneously. Love that. Daring to set boundaries is about having the courage to love ourselves even when we risk disappointing others. And another one, compassionate people ask for what they need. They say no when they need to, and when they say yes, they mean it. They're compassionate because their boundaries keep them out of resentment. If any of these stand out to anybody, feel free to share. If you don't want to share, that's also fine. Similar to relationships, though, we learn a lot about boundaries and boundary setting during our childhoods. Some of us may have seen healthy boundaries be implemented by adults in our lives as children, and others may have witnessed constant boundary violations, while others may have never seen someone set a boundary or teach them that they have the right to set boundaries. So, what exactly are boundaries? Simply put, boundaries describe what it is and what is not okay. The purpose of boundaries is to enable us to engage in healthy and safe relationships that are respectful, authentic, and considerate. Feel free to again add in the chat. I'll leave it open for maybe 30 seconds or so. But what you've learned about setting boundaries, and our current relationships with it. So maybe you learned something and unlearned something, and now you have a new relationship with boundaries. What does this look like? Growing up, what beliefs did you learn or absorb about setting boundaries, and how does it feel to set boundaries now? That was a lot of questions, so I'll leave it open for 1 minute, if folks would like to share. And again, if not, that is totally fine. Yeah, it looks like I have heard a quote where if you're setting boundaries with someone, it is not an attempt to push them away, but an attempt to keep them close in a safe and healthy way. That one always stood out to me. I agree. Thank you so much for sharing. So, for those who may be less familiar with putting boundaries into action, on the screen are some examples of what boundaries can sound like. And if anybody wants to put in the chat, if there's anything else that comes to mind, please feel free to share. In the meantime, I'll just go over a couple of these. I've been thinking about boundaries, and there are some people I want to share with people, and there are some I want to share with people I care about. I need time to think about it. I'm not comfortable discussing that. Please don't bring it up again. I can stay for half an hour, and that's not peer pressured to stay longer. I don't respond to work emails on the weekend. I'm not comfortable with that. If you do it again, I'll have to leave. These are all examples what boundaries can sound like. And if we're not used to hearing this, these might feel not very good. And just acknowledging that is important too. Boundaries can apply to all different aspects of our relationships and connections with other people. There are physical boundaries, such as whether you want to hug people at work or wanting people to ask you before using your office items. There's emotional boundaries, such as letting somebody know you don't have the capacity to listen to their personal concerns in that moment. There's digital boundaries, such as turning your phone on Do Not Disturb a few hours before bedtime or only responding to work emails during the workday. There's sexual boundaries, such as being able to express when you're not in the mood without fear. Relational, such as considering coworkers strictly coworkers and not friends, and time, such as needing to end meetings on time and having a 15-minute transition period until the next meeting. Now that we have a better understanding of the different types of boundaries, I'll launch this two-question poll about boundaries. So, one moment while I get that ready. There you all go. Which type of boundary is the easiest for you to assert into your life? I'll leave this open for about a minute. Okay, so it looks like the easiest boundary for folks to assert within their lives are physical. And it looks like the type of boundary most challenging for folks to assert in their life is emotional and time. Um, yeah, I think that's a pretty overall like common response when we do these. I know that those emotional boundaries can be really hard, especially when we want to help people. Um, and we have folks in our lives that are maybe struggling and we want to be there for them. I think also like I really loved the quote that we talked about before of like um geez, what was it? I can't even remember. Around like doing things because you want to do them, and trusting that if folks are not wanting to do something, they'll advocate for that. And then when they do, it just makes it all the more special because they're fully in it and they're not doing it out of anxiety or trying to people please. I think a lot of those are important. And this piece of this reflects kind of an overall, I think, general experience that folks have when it comes to boundary setting. So thank you all for sharing. Folks that have experienced abuse or are currently experiencing abuse, boundaries can be really tricky. So, one fundamental truth is that abuse is inherently a violation of boundaries on the abusive person's part. So, threats, control, and violations can sometimes be marked as boundaries by an abusive person. So, some survivors may have a very negative association with boundaries since they've been used to justify or fuel abusive behavior. There is also a boundary double standard where the abusive person is allowed secrets, time alone, things that are just theirs, and punishes the victim survivor for asking questions. But on the other hand, the victim survivor is expected to be an open book and must not have boundaries. So, an example of that might be I need to be able to look at your messenger conversations and all of your browsing history, but no, you can't and won't look at mine. Even after a survivor is no longer in an abusive relationship, their beliefs and associations with boundaries can remain and show up in other relationships in ways such as extreme people pleasing, not sharing how they actually feel, or what their needs are. Some survivors that you may work with or have in your life may ask you about how they can actually start to implement boundaries. One thing that we suggest is to use boundaries that are driven by their values. I'll add values worksheet in the chat here if I can. It's having some issues with the copy and pasting, but if I can't, you will all have access to this regardless at the end when these things get emailed out to you. Um, but what that worksheet can really do and help with is help survivors identify their top two values that can help them develop specific boundaries. On the screen, you'll see some examples of values-driven boundaries. One thing that we can all work on, but also survivors specifically, is self-trust. What boundaries do we have for ourselves, and how do we hold on to those, and what do we do if we cross them? If folks feel comfortable, please feel free to pick one of your values, and come up with a useful boundary that respects that value. Also, I am not able to add this to the chat right now, but again, you will all have access. Um, I'll leave this open for maybe 30 seconds or so, and then I'll move on. Hey, we are going to move on. Our last note that I want to talk about in regards to boundaries is about how other people in our lives can set boundaries with us. If we've learned early in life that boundaries are a punishment or a negative consequence, it can be easy to personalize, well, what did I do to cause this boundary? But if we think back to those quotes at the top of the webinar, healthy boundaries can be a gift and an invitation for further connection and investment in the relationship. If someone has never set a healthy boundary with us, we can be a bit unsure about how to respond. But on the screen are some examples of verbal responses to somebody setting a boundary with us. In the chat, again, if anybody feels free to share, please do. Has someone in your life asserted a boundary with you? How did you respond, and how would you want to respond? I'll leave it open for about 30 seconds. Yes, boundaries are definitely harder to discuss because they are so individualized. Thank you for naming that. Well, I'm gonna go ahead and move on, but it is just things to think about, um, moving forward about, hey, if somebody does put in place a boundary with me, how can I respond and how can I recognize this as a boundary and not a punishment, or maybe something that you did wrong versus this is where this person is at, and this is them showing that they care. So, our last part of today is about healthy relationship skill building, how we can build trust and navigate conflict with those in our lives and around us. So I've mentioned trust kind of before a lot, so we'll dive into that a little bit deeper. What exactly is trust? Trust is built in very small moments in any interaction. There is a possibility of connecting with your partner or turning away from your partner. One such moment is not important, but if you're always choosing to turn away, then trust erodes in a relationship very gradually and very slowly. A more practical way of breaking down trust is this acronym, BRAVING, conceptualized by Brene Brown. I'm not sure if anybody has heard of this before, but Brene Brown does a lot of beautiful things around relationships and boundaries, and being our best selves. Yes, thank you, Sharon. Yes, you will receive a copy of the presentation. You'll get a recording and also the PowerPoint slides. So Braving in general stands for boundaries. And as we've talked about quite extensively, reliability, accountability, vault, integrity, non judgment, and generosity. I'll give you all a few moments to take a look at the screen, and please let me know if there are any questions or comments about each or any of these components. I'll give it about 30 seconds. Yes, I love that this is called the anatomy of trust and really breaks down each item. For survivors, having that clear outline of what healthy trust looks like is huge. I totally agree. I totally agree. And I think like with that respect is love quiz too, I think that when folks can see this like on paper, I think that it gives people a reaction, right? Of like, wow, this is something that maybe is present in my relationship or isn't present in my relationship, and it can get those wheels turning, I think, especially when people have access to these things. Also, when you all do get these PowerPoint slides, definitely feel free to like take this stuff, print it out, put it up, pass it out. Because like you said, this could be really helpful for survivors, having that clear outline and breakdown of what these things look like and what should be present in any given relationship. So thank you for saying that. So here's what the different components of braving can sound like. Healthy relationships often include these types of quotes. So, boundaries. It's so good to see you. Do you have anything to get to after this? What's a good time for us to wrap up? Can I ask you about this? If worry, no worries. If not, feel free to leave whenever you need to. Reliability, I'll set a reminder in my phone so I remember. Accountability, I want to apologize for how I behaved. It was hurtful, and I'm so sorry for causing you pain. How can I make things better? Being things kind of in control and having somebody tell you what can be done to make something better versus you going into a situation doing what you think would make it better that might not actually benefit a person who was harmed. Um, the vault is the one that people often, a lot of times, have questions about, and it can be tricky when it comes to people who have relationships with people who use abuse. The idea of vault can be weaponized as a form of control, coercion, and or isolation. So it mainly applies to information that isn't harming someone else or preventing someone from accessing safety and support. Um, Brene Brown also has a really great quote about integrity, and she says that integrity is about choosing courage over comfort, choosing what is right over what is fun, fast, or easy, and lastly, choosing to practice our values rather than simply professing them. Um, so yes, that's what some of those things look like within that I guess like subsection of the of braving. So on the screen, you can see a few more examples of non-judgment and generosity. Generosity is about assuming the most generous thing about someone's intentions and checking in with them later. So now that I hope that we have a deeper understanding of braving, I'm going to just do another poll of what elements of trust you would like to improve. Okay, so which elements of trust do you wish to nurture in your connections with client survivors or program participants? I'll leave it open for 30-ish seconds. Yes, boundaries. I think honestly too, this is another one that boundaries one is another one that I think a lot of people when they take this webinar do. Again, I think like being in helping professions um can really blur those because I think we all have our hearts in it. We all want to be helpful and try and do everything that we can, but in turn, um could cause more harm by lack of boundaries. So thank you all for doing this. Then which elements of trust do you wish to nurture in your connections with friends or family members? It also looks like boundaries is a big one. We love boundaries. This is why it's so important. So thank you all for sharing. I also want to include a quick note about self trust. When we talk about self trust, we're talking about our ability to meet our own needs for safety. Excuse me, one moment. Oh, sorry, I just needed to mute my phone. um, but yeah, so self trust, meeting our own needs. Do we know that we'll be able to get to do what we want to get through the day or a difficult situation? Are you a person you can rely on in a crisis? Self trust really comes with the knowledge that no matter what you're faced with, you know you won't give up on yourself. Also, we have a webinar on YouTube, on our YouTube page that is about journaling for self-trust, and building that relationship with yourself, and boundaries for yourself. Here's a side-by-side table about how trust can be built with both other people and ourselves. This can be a helpful tool for yourself when working with survivors and for client survivors themselves. I'm going to add another poll. Come on. Okay. What is your current response to conflict? So, why do we as people a lot of times loathe conflict? There's false assumptions. Conflict means that the relationship is broken or doomed or never to be repaired. Sometimes for some people, conflict means threats to one's safety. Being free to disagree with your partner is one thing, but actually expressing that disagreement is another. It can be really hard to say to someone, I want to do it this way, actually. Or, can you please watch movies at a quieter volume? If you're not used to speaking up for your own wants and needs, parts of healthy relationship conflict is generosity, believing that your partner is on your team and will help you to achieve the best possible outcome. I'm not sure if folks are able to see the poll. It's showing up on my screen, but let me see. Are folks able to see that? It's not looking like it's not appearing on mine. Shoot. One moment. I'm gonna try this again. Sometimes these can be a little finicky. See. And okay, there we go. Okay. Current responses to conflict. Go ahead and pick one of these. I'll leave it open for 30-ish seconds or so. It looks like we're kind of evened out. I don't like conflict, but will endure it if necessary. I am not afraid of conflict and feel confident writing it out if I feel safe. I avoid conflict at all costs. Yeah, I instigate conflict because it's what I'm familiar with. Yeah, it definitely does. It definitely does. I think that also a lot of this too, I feel like can be more of a trauma response, which I'm sure is something that is agreed with. But yeah, no, that's super real. Some folks have a really hard time um just being comfortable, and that comfortability to them could feel like conflict. So for sure. Yes, thank you. I'm going to end this poll. So, a common misconception about abuse is that if the couple learned to communicate in healthier ways, there would be no conflict or abusive behavior or some version of this. Here's why using healthy communication won't fix an abusive relationship, and in many cases, may actually increase the danger for a victim survivor of domestic violence. The very nature of an abuser's way of thinking makes the relationship an unwelcome and hostile environment toward healthy communication. Should a victim of domestic violence implement basic concepts of healthy communication, such as expressing thoughts and feelings, seeing healthy boundaries, expecting mutual respect, it is viewed by the abusive person as a threat to the power and control that they have over the victim survivor. When an abusive person perceives that their partner is challenging them, they become more motivated to regain power and control over the victim survivor by any means necessary. Often, this results in the increase of intimidation and or violence towards the victim survivor. So back to our healthy and unhealthy comparisons, here is a chart for conflict. Studies have shown that being able to work through a conflict effectively and compassionately can actually bring two people closer together and forge a deeper bond. So as you can see here, just kind of a comparison of healthy versus unhealthy conflict. Excuse me. And I think it does a really good job of showing how things can kind of seep into this category of being more unhealthy. But really, it all is about collaboration and repairing anything that is creating bumps in the relationship. So this is we, this is I. Unhealthy or even potentially abusive people may utilize these four different behaviors in response to a conflict. So, criticism, contempt, defensiveness, and stonewalling. I'm curious to if anybody has ever seen any of these tactics in action. You don't necessarily need to share any specific examples, but just something to think about if this is something that we do in our relationships, if this is something that we've seen happen in relationships, um, and maybe not, in which case you're very lucky and fortunate. So here's an alternative to the four horsemen. So soften the start. The first 3 minutes of the conversation really set the tone, and you want to encourage collaboration. And you cannot do that by yelling or getting defensive. Um, you can complain, but don't blame. No matter how at fault you think your partner is, approaching them with criticisms and accusations is not productive. So instead of blaming your partner with, you said you would clean the backyard today and it's still a mess, you could try something more simple. Hey, there are still some fallen leaves in the gutter and tennis balls everywhere. We agreed you'd rake and clean up after Buster, and I'm really upset about this. Statements that are focused on the I, the me, are less critical, and don't put your partner on the defensive. So instead of saying, you are not listening to me, you can say, I don't feel heard right now. Focus on how you're feeling and not accusing your partner. So instead of accusing or blaming your partner, simply describe what you see in the situation. Keeping yourself in check will be worth it in the end. Instead of "You never watch our kids," try something along the lines of, "I'm really exhausted. Do you think you could help out with the kids?" Your partner is more likely to consider your point of view and deliver the results you are hoping for with this approach. Being polite and appreciative. Just because you're in conflict with your partner does not mean that your respect and affection for them has diminished. Um, and don't store things up. One issue leads to another, and you can suddenly find yourself bringing up a laundry list of issues that feel related, but really are not. The solution is don't wait to bring up an issue with your partner. Your conflict discussions will be far more productive when you don't allow the situation to escalate, and just by communicating, right? And make time to self-soothe. If you need to maybe start this conversation and maybe it's not going the way that you want it to as far as like your delivery, or somebody else's delivery, you can take space and come back to that. But also maybe taking space after the conversation is had, can be helpful too. And lastly, we're going to talk about emotional regulation within the context of relationships. Emotional regulation refers to the process by which individuals influence which emotions they have, when they have them, and how they experience and express their feelings. Emotional regulation can be automatic or controlled, conscious or unconscious. It may have effects at one or more points in the emotion producing process. So, aligned action takes a compassionate and values based spin on opposite action, which usually encourages us to identify our emotions, what action we want to take that might not be supportive to us overall, and to do the exact opposite of it. This can be helpful for simple things like getting out of bed in the morning or sending an email. But oftentimes, when we are regulating our emotions in the context of a relationship, it might not feel as supportive to do just the opposite of what we want to do as guided and driven by our emotions. For example, if we want to yell and scream because we're mad, being told we should do the opposite and be quiet and small can be triggering for people who have experienced trauma, specifically control from a loved one. Aligned action is different because it encourages us to build up awareness of our own values, which our top two values can be identified using three criteria. Does this define me? Is this who I am at my best? Is this a filter that I use to make hard decisions? Then, similar to opposite action, we acknowledge and give space for our emotions. Naming them can be powerful in not letting them take the driver's seat, and then assessing if the associated behavior is aligned with our values and adjusting if they aren't. Here's an example. I get into an argument with my mom. She says something that makes me feel mad and rejected. My immediate reaction is to say something hurtful back and leave the room. But I know that my top two values are growth and connection. This automatic behavior is not aligned with my values. Instead, I might still honor how I'm feeling and honor my values by telling my mom that it is important for me to feel connected to her and what she said made me feel rejected. Again, this personal values worksheet you will all have access to when you get the slides. So I define connection as the energy that exists between people when they feel seen, heard, and valued, when they can give and receive without judgment, and when they derive sustenance and strength from the relationship. So, ending domestic violence takes all of us, and it includes things like choosing healthy behaviors over abusive ones, shifting culture away from victim blaming, holding people who use abusive actions accountable for changing their behavior and beliefs, while also remembering that they are choosing to use abuse. That is a choice that they are making consciously. And lastly, modeling, educating, and discussing healthy relationship dynamics and skills across the lifespan. This is really how we break cycles and how we can teach folks how to be the best person that they can be for themselves, but also other people. Here are some resources that we have available, at least here in Minnesota. I'm not sure if everybody is necessarily calling in from Minnesota, but I would encourage you to look at your local resources on a state level, a city level, a county level, all of the levels, all of the things. This is also just some additional research. I'm sorry, not research, but resources that you all can take advantage of. In your lives, in your work that might help the folks that you're serving, the folks in your lives, or maybe even you yourself. Again, you'll all have access to this. And thank you all for your commitment to survivors' safety. Here's Women's Advocates information. Also, we have a ton of webinars on YouTube that are pre-recorded. So if anybody is interested in learning more, you are completely able to do so. Here's our pop-up advocacy online survivor support group. You can find information for that on our website. And then we also have a post-webinar survey, which again, for some reason, it's not letting me copy and paste it into the chat, but you will all get this in the email that is sent out afterwards. I really truly appreciate everybody being here and sharing space. I hope that you all have a great day. I will put my email in the chat if anybody has any questions um, or are looking for any other resources. I try and do that in case anybody wants to reach out. Otherwise, I hope that everybody has a beautiful day and a great rest of your week. I'll leave this up for a minute or so folks can take that down if they need it. Otherwise, you are all free to go. And again, I hope that you have a great week. It was great to be able to be in space with all of you, and I hope that you all took something away, even if it was small. Amazing. Thank you all. See you.